Okay, so this morning we're going to have a look at something fairly straightforward, loading 120 film into a camera, in this case a Yashica 124G. I'll also show you a few pictures taken with the camera so you can get an idea of why it's worth the trouble. So with this one, turn towards the O, back pops open, and then we simply move what was the spool that the film came on to become a take-up spool. It's always worth keeping a few old 120 spools. I always have a few kicking about just in case. Make sure it clicks in nicely. This is a film that I've ruined. We'll use it in a minute for loading some tanks. Okay, so it just pops in, we click the film into place, run it, in this case, some 120 cameras are different, but run it over the top of where the lens is, and I'll just use the wind on crank a little bit to pull the film forward. Now, in lots of cameras, but not all, you have to look for a mark that shows you where to roll to. Now in this case there are actually two. That's for 220 film and this is for 120. 220 is more or less unobtainable now, so we'll need to catch the positions about there. You don't have to be accurate to the millimetre, that's about right. And then we close the back, also checking that we're set to 12 exposures on the back plate so the pressure's right, and then close the film back, tighten it till it locks, and then wind on to frame one. And the job now is to get it into the developing tank. Now, it's not as easy as developing 35mm film, but it is worth it, I promise. So, a few tips. I like to use a metal developing tank rather than a plastic one. Traditionally they were used in labs, not I think because they were better, but simply because they dry fast, and actually you can reload these wet. Now, this is my first tip. Buy yourself one of these reels. This is a Hughes reel, actually made in the UK, and I think I've used a few. I think it's by far the easiest and most consistent to load. Tank doesn't matter so much. This is a Nikkor from Japan, but as long as it fits, it doesn't really matter. Now, either using a changing bag or in a dark room, we're going to load the film. So all of these next processes would normally happen in the dark, and they'll look very straightforward here, but they're not. So we've got these items in our darkroom or equivalent, and incidentally, if you're wearing a watch, take that off. First thing to do is to make sure you've got the reel the right way around. In the dark, feel round the outside of the spool until you hit that metal protrusion there, the end of the reel, if you like, because just below it is where in a second we'll be pressing to attach the film into this little slot that we're going to make here. From here on, there are a couple of ways we can do it. I'll show you the way I usually do it first. So in the dark, I start to wind the film out against my hand until I can feel the beginning of the emulsion. It's actually there, but obviously you won't be able to see it. And I tear the paper at that point and discard it. And then I feel for the end of the film. You see, still completely in the dark. Pull a little bit of it forward, and I actually use my finger, thumb and third finger, and I just pull the film like that, and then to load the reel, because these Hughes reels load so easily, all I do is turn the reel and guide it with, again, my index finger. If it catches just momentarily, then I'll push it further and the film just basically falls onto the reel. What you really don't want is to hear any nasty cracking, because that will come out probably on the negatives there's horrible little marks which you really want to try and avoid, obviously, if you can. So you just carry on like this to reach the end of the reel. Only takes a few seconds, and there should be absolutely no resistance. Now, I tend to leave the film on the spool. It isn't essential. I'll show you another way of doing it now. But then we've just got to tear the film off, and then I tuck the last bit in with my hand, and that's ready to go. A good way of checking is to just run your fingers in the dark around the edge of the reel, and you shouldn't feel anything sticking out. Okay, so that's one way of doing it, but you can actually load them the other way, and lots of people do this. They unspool the film completely in the dark, and they load this end first. In other words, the end of the film. Because it's a little bit stiffer, it can be a little bit easier to load, and lots of people I know prefer to do that. It's probably a better way. Fuse reels are so well manufactured and the tolerances seem to be so tight that the film just seems to know where to go. And honestly, it's worth it, because if you get pieces of film touching, then you'll get areas that aren't developed, and those negs will likely be ruined. So that's how to load a 120 roll, and I'll show just a few final images. You can see a lot more on my website of stuff that's shot on 120, and I'll come back to these cameras in due course. But anyway, I hope that's a bit of an introduction in terms of the practical issues of getting the film loaded.